So today we are on our 5th week of our study of Brene Brown's book, which is Braving the Wilderness, the Quest for True Belonging, and the Courage to Stand Alone. And many of you are participating in small group studies of the book. And the chapter we're studying today is, there is a child in the room. The chapter we're studying today is Speak Truth to Bullshit and Be Civil. So I'm not advocating you use that word. But I really thank Brene Brown for giving me the permission to say it in church. There are many times I've wanted to say that word in church. But I won't say it again. We'll call it BS. But yeah, she's talking about how we speak truth in the face of what she calls BS. And so I think this is a very timely book for where we are today in our country, really in our world, and what we're facing. And she talks about that quite a bit in the book, about the cause of the divisiveness that we're experiencing, the polarization that we're experiencing. And what I want to say about that, just to remind us all, is that while it may seem like it's a new phenomenon, it really isn't. That we may be more aware of it now, it may be more in our faces because of the social media and all of the things that we are bombarded with every day. That's not to say that we're not to take it seriously, because I believe we are, and it's our opportunity to respond to what's happening in the world today. But I just want to say that we need to be, I think it's important for us to be conscious of that began since the beginning of our country, or even before that. I mean, we've experienced a lot of dissension. And so how do we do that? How do we look at that? How do we stand in that? How do we be in that from a spiritual perspective? And she talks about that as well. The cause of what we're experiencing today is that we've forgotten that we share a common humanity. We are all one as human beings, that we have common experiences. But even more than that, she talks about how we've lost touch with our connection, our spiritual connection. That we've forgotten that we are one in spirit. We are one in the power and the presence of the divine. And we've lost sight of that. And so that's very important. So last week we talked about that people are hard to hate close up. Move In was the title of that chapter, is the title of that chapter we talked about last week, and some ways that we can do that. So this week is about speaking truth to BS and being civil. How do we do that in the face of what we might be witnessing all around us sometimes on the news and different things that we see? And I'm going to talk about that. I want to talk about that. But first, I think it's more important to bring it home. And talk about our own BS. Really investigate for ourselves our own BS. Because I think that's a great place to start. We look at ourselves, explore what's going on with ourselves and the causes of some of maybe our own BS before we look at other people's. As they say in AA, clean up your side of the street first. Jesus said, looking at the speck in somebody else's eye when you've got a whole log in your own. And it's important for us to do that, and so I want to explore that a little bit. Brene says her definition, and I could look for it, but I won't take time to do that. She says that her definition of BS is a wholesale dismissal of truth. And that it's different from a lie in that a lie is just a disregard for the truth. We might know what the truth is, but we don't adhere to that. BS is about, I don't even care about that. This is my opinion, so this is my truth. So it's a wholesale dismissal of what is really true, is the way she defines it. And she talks about why we do that, why we engage in BS. And she talks about how we're defending an idea of ourselves. That we want to have an opinion about everything. Even if we know nothing about the topic, We think we have to have an opinion, or somebody's going to think we're uninformed or ignorant or whatever we think that is. We have to have an opinion. We have to take a stand for everything. And I'm not suggesting we don't take a stand. I want to talk more about that as well, because that came up after last week's talk. But that to understand where it comes from for us sometimes. Where is it born? And I think that what I want to talk about a little bit is when we talk about BS as a wholesale dismissal of truth, I want to start where I like to always start, and that is with our truth. What is true? What is absolutely true? And I know some people would say there is no absolute truth, that everything's relative. And I know that we could probably debate that ad nauseum. But when I talk about absolute truth, I'm talking about what we in Unity believe is the absolute truth, and that is that there is one power and one presence, and that is love. God is love. And as Father Rohr talked about, we are that love. We are expressions of that divine love. We all are. Every human being is an expression of that divine love. The two primary unity principles say there's only one, and that one is God, that one is love, that one is omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence. So we are all that. And yet, when we come into these life experiences, we begin to forget that. It's like the story of the Golden Buddha, many of you I'm sure are familiar with. Apparently there's a story, Jack Canfield tells this story in one of his books, or more than one of his books, about in the 1950s, there was a monastery, a Buddhist monastery in Thailand that was having to relocate. And so they had this huge 10-foot statue of a Buddha, this concrete statue of a Buddha, and they had to move it to a new location. So they brought in a crane. They knew it would take a crane to lift it, to move it to its new location. So the crane arrived, and the crane tried to lift the Buddha statue, and they realized that the crane they had brought was not strong enough, did not have enough power. And so they were a bit confused by that. They figured if it's a concrete Buddha, it must weigh at this level, it must weigh a certain amount. So they had to set it back down, and the next morning we're coming back to move the Buddha with different equipment. Well, that night, they covered it and to protect it. And so that night, one of the monks heard something outside, and so he went out to be sure to check on the Buddha. And so he lifted up the covering, and he had his flashlight, and all of a sudden he saw this shiny something from the Buddha. So he was curious about that. So he began to go in there, and he was chipping away at the concrete, and eventually realized that underneath all the concrete was solid gold. There was a 10-foot statue of the Buddha, a solid gold statue that had been covered over by concrete in order to protect the Buddha. What they assume is that at some point, hundreds of years before, that the monks who were in charge of this Buddha protected it, covered it from an invading army that was coming in to conquer the country, and that all of them were killed, and so nobody knew. Nobody knew about this golden Buddha beneath all of that layer of other stuff. And I think that's similar to us, that we are love, we are gold, we are an expression of the divine, and we cover it over with other stuff. And then we think we have to defend that other stuff. So I brought some props today to kind of example what I'm talking about. In honor of Halloween, I thought it would be kind of fun, and I'll use myself as an example. So, I'm born into the world as a little boy. And so I put on the mantle of being a male and all the BS that goes along with being a male. Boys like blue, they don't like pink. Boys like trucks. They don't like dolls. Boys don't cry. Man up. Be a man, and all the BS that we take on around being male in our culture. And then what happens is this, and I'm going to reframe this a little bit. When I'm talking about BS in this way, it's a belief system, or it's a belief about self. That's really about who we're not, but we cover it over with who we think we are. And so we grow up, and we begin to express that BS in many different ways that may not be loving if we're not conscious of that. So I take on this mantle of being male in our society and all that that involves. For me, I take on the mantle of being the peacekeeper, the good little boy, the one who never does anything wrong, who protects everything else, who is the peacekeeper in my family, who makes good grades all the time, who never gets angry, who never is sad, who never really has any feelings, because if I had feelings, that would disrupt the whole family. So I take on the mantle and all the BS that comes with being a child who has to be the peacekeeper. Anybody relate to that? And then I take on this mantle of being born in the rural South. Speaking of blue and gray, being born in the rural South in a family that was, how would I say kindly, a family that embodied everything you think of when you think about the rural South. Racism, homophobia, Christian values. So I take that on, this idea of the Southern pride thing, you know. If you're not from the South, you may not quite understand what that is. But this idea of, you know, I look at what's happening today in so many ways of this white nationalism movement that is going on, and I think that was part of that culture embedded in the culture of the rural South. So I take on that BS. Then I also take on being an American. Being an American. And at the risk of upsetting anyone, this idea of nationalism, period. That America, we have to protect our way of life. Well, who decides what the way of life is as an American? We have freedoms, yes, and I appreciate those freedoms. There are many people around the world who don't get to enjoy those freedoms. Are we the only ones that get to do that because we're Americans? So we take on the mantle just because we're born in this country. And I'm not degrading this country. I'm just saying it's something to question. Am I holding to this mantle of being an American and what that entails, what that embodies sometimes? And then I take on this mantle of being a Christian. Oh my God, talk about BS. That comes from judgmental Christianity, about right and wrong, good and bad. You're born a sinner. You'll never be worthy. So you spend your life living, if you don't question that, living the BS of not being good enough, always trying to be better, always trying to be right, always trying to fit in, always trying to be good. And so there's that BS that goes along with that. And then there's the BS that goes along with being gay. If you're gay, you kind of probably know some of the BS that happens around that. And protecting that identity. The belief system. Again, about not being worthy, not being valuable, not being good, not being acceptable, and all that comes from that. And so we take that on. We take all of that on, and it covers up sometimes who we truly are when we allow it to be our belief system, and we defend it. We spend a lot of energy defending all of that. And that's, I think, what she's talking about with the BS that we experience. And then, to top it all off, there's this mantle of being a minister. Underneath all of that, and all of that affecting how I be a minister, and all the BS that is associated with being a minister. If you're a minister, you know, right, Doris? You know, and I'm not, again, please don't hear that I'm degrading that or anybody, but it's my own stuff, not yours. It's my own belief system around who I have to be, what I have to be, and defending that. And that's where that BS really comes from. And so what I want to say as I'm talking about this is that looking at our own belief systems and how we want to defend that, and how we engage in our own BS in order to defend all the ways we think about ourselves. Now, what I want to say about that, I talked about this one time before, and somebody who left the sanctuary said, but our identities matter. And I had to think about that. Our identities matter. So how do these identities matter? How do they matter to us? They matter to us because it is what we've taken on. I think it's important for us to question all of the BS that we associate with all of these labels that we take on. Not to say not to say it's not important. But what I want to say about that is this. We allow these identities as a privileged, white, Southern, male, Christian-adjacent, American, gay, American minister. What's important in those identities is that I allow those identities to be expressions of the Christ that I am. And I allow the Christ to be what shows forth through every one of those identities. And to speak the truth of the Christ light, the Christ consciousness, the Christed being, to allow all of these identities, to stand as an American and say, I am standing firmly in my Christ consciousness, and I'm speaking the truth of what I know to be true as my unity, as my oneness. To stand as a unity minister and say, this is what we teach, this is what we believe, and this is what we believe is going to transform the world. To stand as a white, privileged gay male and to say out loud my truth. And so I think that's why these things matter. And our identity, how we can use all of those identities for good. So I said I was going to speak to how do we stand in the face of someone else's BS. And Brene Brown talks about that in her book with this idea of civility. And she says that there are three components of this idea of civility. That we stand with generosity, that we make the most generous assumption possible about the person or the situation that we are perceiving as BS. And believe me, I know that is challenging sometimes. The most generous assumption we can make about the other person. Empathy. To understand that they too have all of this stuff. All of the stuff that they're protecting. All of the stuff that they are trying to enforce and to uplift and to protect. That we all have these shared experiences, connecting with their fear, with their sadness, with their anger, with whatever is happening with them. So, generosity and empathy and curiosity. Be curious. When you're faced with someone's BS, just be curious. Tell me more. Tell me more about where you learned this information. Tell me more about this study that you're citing. Tell me where I can find it. Tell me where I can read it. Tell me where this is coming from for you. I really want to get you. And so making the most generous assumption, connecting empathically with another person, and then being curious about them. And so I know that that's easier to do when you're face to face with someone, that when you're watching someone on television, or you're hearing them on the radio, or some podcast, that you don't have that opportunity to really ask them questions, to be curious with them. We can exercise generosity. We can exercise empathy. But the other piece is a little bit more challenging. And I know that that can be something that we're all faced with. So what I would say about that is, because I struggle with that as well. I struggle with that sometimes. How do we do that? And so this is what I would like to offer, and you can try it if you would like. What I would say is, first of all, stand in your absolute truth. As much as possible, stand in your absolute truth. There is one power, and that power is the divine love expressing as me. As Jesus said, seek first the kingdom. And the kingdom is the consciousness of oneness, the consciousness of unity, the consciousness of God, the consciousness of the Christ that you are. Seek first the kingdom and righteousness. What is righteousness? Right thinking, right speaking, right acting. Acting, speaking, and thinking that is in alignment with your absolute truth. So stand firm in your truth with a capital T as we understand it. Second is do your homework. Don't assume that just because those who you share a political party with know the truth. Don't assume that those news programs that you love to listen to really embody the whole truth. Be well informed. Do your own research. Watch Fox News and MSNBC or CNN. Hear both sides. Don't just associate with the people who agree with you. Right? Listen. Be well informed. Educate yourself on the issues, on the facts. And then when you have that opportunity, engage in those conversations, civil conversations with people you disagree with. Go to events that offer that opportunity to listen and to hear and to speak. Listen with generosity and empathy and curiosity and compassion. Love. Because it is love that is going to heal us. Love is the only power that can bring us together. And so we're talking about speaking truth to BS. I would say, first of all, look at your own BS. Speak truth to that first. Speak truth to yourself first. Allow the Christ to shine through you. And when you're able to do that, I think that will transform your own life and transform the world. Then you can stand in the face of someone else and be in that place of speaking truth for them and to them when you have the opportunity. Yeah? 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 All right. Thank you for today.